Christ, the one who's enough, calls us. He says, he who would save his life would lose it. He says, take up your cross. These words are hard to hear. For many of us, these statements are difficult. Why did God demand such things? Is God an arbitrary being who makes followers go through difficulties for his pleasure or to prove their dedication to him? Is God so petty? Is our Lord making us prove our faithfulness to him? This teaching seems backwards and repressive. Why would anyone have to go through such difficulties to follow Jesus? It seems like he enjoys making life difficult. But let me give you a different scenario. Suppose someone came to you and said, I want you to eat healthier. I want you to get up early and begin a disciplined regimen of exercises. You need to push your body to the limits. Suppose this man is a successful trainer of world-class athletes, and he sees in you the potential of becoming one also. Would you think this challenge to discipline and self-sacrifice to be repressive and backward? We understand that if we want to achieve something like that, you have to pay the price. Or how about those who are challenged to go into military service? They too are asked to engage in very difficult and challenging practices. They have to put aside their own wishes and desires and follow the rules and the commands of those in charge. And again, we don't think that this is repressive and backward. As a matter of fact, we honor highly those who are willing to make this sacrifice. Maybe we would not do it ourselves, but we see the reasonableness of these disciplines. And one last example. How about when our children go off to college? Or go off to take on the responsibilities of an adult? Don't we ask them to be self-disciplined? If they're going to college, don't we ask them to go to bed at a reasonable time, get up in time to go to class, to put aside your pleasure to do your studies or go to work? We don't think it's unreasonable to demand them to have some discipline. Our children, men and women who are soldiers and athletes, are asked to do disciplined things, to become competent at what they're doing, whether it's a soldier or whether it's the ability to perform well in an athletic contest, or whether it's to get the grades to be able to pass. In all of these cases, there's some measure of self-denial and some measure of having to push yourself. If you've ever exercised, you know that pushing yourself physically can at times be exhausting and even painful. But we don't think twice about asking that of people in those circumstances. But when Jesus suggests that we ought to deny ourselves and follow him, we're put off. Even though, if we really understood it, the act of self-discipline, the act of self-denial, the willingness to take up the cross will help us develop better the character of Christ within us. This self-denial, this sacrifice, helps us attain the goal of becoming like Jesus. So why does this goal of becoming like Jesus and self-discipline and self-sacrifice seem so difficult? It's because we live in an age where we don't really want to do these kind of things. It is a cultural thing that makes us think that God is backward and repressive. We've been brought up with the idea that anything that opposes my feelings and my wishes is contrary to making me happy and contrary to wisdom and good sense. We argue that we should be free, and by that being free to do what I want to do whenever I want to do it. This mantra that is in our societies has infiltrated our churches. But Jesus makes clear that this is not the way of life, but the way of death. Life comes when we give up these fantasies and lay down our lives so we might be true followers of Jesus and find true life even as he did. Real life comes when we care for the needs of others and not ourselves first. Again, even such issues as the social justice issues that are going on. Real life comes when we put aside our desires and wishes and choose to follow the one who gives us life and who is our very life. It is the life of flourishing, of real, genuine, not happiness, but joy and flourishing. It is the life of abundance. It is the life lived as God designed it to be. And in doing so, we find the life as Jesus did. And that's what Jesus is talking about in this passage. Because we remember the context, as I already said, this passage occurs just after Jesus had come to Caesarea Philippi. And there he had asked them, "Who do the people say I am? Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus looks at the mountain in front of him, the rock, and says, "On this rock I will build my church," over the political and religious powers that dominate the pagan societies. I will rule over them. They will be under my foot. And then it says, immediately after finishing that, Jesus began to teach them, to talk to them about what was coming. He began to instruct them that here is the circumstances of what's going to happen in the next little bit. It is necessary. There's a verb. It's pronounced day. It's the verb of divine necessity. And what this verb says here is it is divinely necessary that I go to Jerusalem. That in Jerusalem I will suffer. I will be killed. And I will be raised on the third day. My suspicion is as Jesus is telling them this, they never heard that fourth point. Because they were shocked, incredulous at the idea that Jesus was going to die. I mean, hadn't he just said that I will triumph over all my enemies? How does one die and be triumphant? You know, we know the conquering hero never dies. He survives. He goes on, or at least that's what our society paints the picture of. And the disciples, and Peter particularly, are bothered by this. What would you say to them? They were expecting one thing, and here Jesus says something different. But we have to understand that when it says it was divinely necessary, this is not some arbitrary thing on God's part. God didn't just allow Jesus to go through suffering because he wanted someone to suffer. In part, it was to bring redemption, no doubt about it. His suffering is redemptive suffering. But it also says in Hebrews that Jesus went through these sufferings because through them he learned obedience. He learned what it was like for others to suffer. He entered into their pain. Even as I talked about earlier in our being compassionate for those who are in need. Jesus, through his suffering, entered into our pain. He got a grasp of what it was like. Remember, Jesus was human. In Luke 2, it says he grew in favor and stature with men and with God. He was developing, and part of his, let's say, character development as the Son of God was the suffering that he went through. It made him a more understanding high priest, the high priest who could sympathize with our weaknesses. So Jesus said it was necessary that he go to Jerusalem, he suffer, he die. and he'd be raised on the third life. And now he's going to say to the disciples in just a moment, we might say in the context, that he's going to tell them there's some necessary things that they have to go through that will in some ways be very similar to the suffering that Jesus had to go through. It will be necessary for them to carry their cross, to deny themselves. But before we do that, let's take a moment to look at Peter's opposition here. Because Peter is thinking purely from that human perspective. So Jesus begins to teach them this. And then it says in the very same wording, Peter began to rebuke him. Can you imagine that? Peter, who just said, you're the Messiah, you're the Lord, you're the Son of the living God. Now he's going to rebuke him and tell him he's doing wrong. That's pretty bold. But Jesus is pretty bold in responding back. He says, get behind me, Satan. Satan, we know, is the adversary, the accuser. Jesus says to Peter, you're a stumbling block to me. What he's saying is, I believe, and this goes with what happened in the garden. When Jesus was in the garden, he prayed that the cup would pass from him because he saw the suffering that was coming and it overwhelmed him. But Peter comes now and says, don't talk about dying, even though that's God's plan. And in this way, he's very close to Satan, who was tempting Jesus in the wilderness when he said, I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth if you'll worship me. Take the easy path. Worship me. You don't have to go through the suffering and the difficulties, and you get what you want anyway. And that's kind of what Peter is saying. And because it resonates with Jesus, who really doesn't want to suffer that way? Who would? Peter's words are tempting to Jesus. Now we know that he rejects the temptation. As he did with Satan, he does with Peter, and in the garden, he chooses to do God's will. But we have to understand that this was a difficult moment. And Peter is coming here saying, don't go that way. Don't do it. And Jesus rebukes him for being part of those who are resisting God's plan, who are tempting him to resist God's plan. It's interesting, Peter, the rock, Petra, now becomes a stumbling stone for Jesus. The wordplay is interesting. But Jesus rejects it. Jesus will go to the cross. He will suffer. He will learn obedience. He will bring salvation to us. And that's the good news. But this is where our call comes in now. Here we are called to follow the example of Jesus. As it was necessary for him to go through suffering, he now turns to the disciples. And he says, it is necessary, though that word isn't directly there. He says, if you are wishing to be my disciple, if you 12 men have it as your desire to follow me, to be my disciples, to walk, as we've talked about before, in the dust of the rabbi, if Jesus is going to be persecuted, if Jesus is going to suffer, if Jesus is going to die, then we must follow him into these places too. We must follow the difficult path, the narrow path, the road of suffering. But it will transform us. It will help us in what N.T. Wright talks about, the development of our Christian character. So we must deny ourselves. We make ourselves not the first priority. We put others first. We take up our cross, the instrument of death. Doesn't mean we're going to die physically, but it means that we take up those things that are death-producing in us, that we might find life. And then we follow Jesus. We go in his footprints. These things are necessary. They're hard, they're difficult, but they're not repressive. They're not backward. They're a way for us to become the people that God desires us to be. Stop making ourselves the first priority. Stop seeking our own good and seek the good of others. Take up our cross and follow him. N.T. Wright, in his book, After You Believe, writes, the ideal goal the ultimate aim, calling us to the hard road of self-denial. The idea, in other words, that Jesus of Nazareth meant what he said when he spoke of the people taking up their cross to follow him. This is what Jesus wants of us. It's what Jesus does, not because it's some arbitrary thing, but because it is for our benefit. It is so that we can become the people that are life-giving and have life within themselves. It's not easy. It's a difficult path. Jesus had to suffer, and he learned obedience. He learned how to enter into our pain through the things that he suffered. And when we do these things, when we take up our cross, when we deny ourselves, we are better able to enter into other people's pain, to understand their suffering, to be there with them in that suffering. I want to conclude with one other quote from N.T. Wright. He says, "The New Testament's vision of a genuinely good human life is a life of character formed by God's promised future, as a life that future-shaped character lived within the ongoing story of God's people, and with that, a freshly worked notion of virtue." In other words, let me say it one more time. A genuinely good life as a life lived, a life of character formed by God's promised future, the future of heaven, being with kingdom of God. As a life that is future-shaped character lived within the ongoing story of God's people. The kingdom of heaven's life lived now is what God desires of us. Will you surrender to that as our next song encourages us to?